Weller, the original wheated bourbon and probably the most popular name in wheated bourbon as well. Named after the legend William Larue Weller, the man that is credited with inventing the wheated bourbon in 1849, where wheat replaces rye in the mash bill, producing a smoother and richer flavor. In 1909, Weller's namesake company eventually went on to merge with his former employee, the Van Winkle's APH Stitzel Distillery, to form the most famous distillery of all time in the Stitzel-Weller Distillery. It became renowned for such brands as W.L. Weller, Old Fitzgerald, Rebel Yell, and the infamous Pappy van Winkle bourbon lines. Because of that lineage, Weller has become very hard to find. What are some alternatives? Let's take a look at Weller. Pappy van Winkle was first released in the early 1990s as a way for third-generation distiller Julian Van Winkle III to get rid of old bourbon that had been sitting in barrels. He slapped a picture of his grandfather, Julian Pappy van Winkle, on the label and called it ultra-aged. It's been produced by Bufallo Trace since 2002. On October 15, 2013, Bufallo Trace Distillery reported that about 200 bottles of rare, renowned Pappy van Winkle bourbon, valued at about $26,000, had gone missing from its Frankfort, Kentucky facility. Now, whether or not you believe the crime actually happened, was a made-up marketing ploy, or was just a Bufallo Trace employee that took bottles to sell at a premium after the publicity, the crime made international headlines which catapulted both the popularity and value of Pappy van Winkle through the roof. As the bourbon boom took off and people started hearing of the Pappy van Winkle story, Weller, that once budget and available wheated bourbon, started flying off the shelves. Now, once people learned Weller is the same juice they used to make Pappy, Special Reserve Antique 107 and Weller 12 became almost impossible to find. Today, Bufallo Trace has capitalized on that popularity by releasing new offerings in the Weller lineup, including CYPB, which was a crowdsourced Weller crafted online through buffalotrace.com, Weller Full Proof, which you see right here, which is the 114 proof version of Weller for enthusiasts who like their bourbon with a higher proof and fuller flavor, and the upcoming Weller Single Barrel, which is a single barrel selection of Weller from the distillery bottled at 97 proof. Since it's so hard to find these days, I wanted to sit down and taste some bourbons that would be perfect alternatives based on availability, price, and drinking experience. So besides the 90 proof 12 year that you see here, the rest of the Weller lineup averages about 7 years old and uses a mash bill supposedly around 70% corn, 16% wheat, and 14% malted barley. Entry proof is 114 into the barrel and are all chill filtered except for the Weller Full Proof. The Special Reserve is bottled at 90 proof, the Antique is at 107 proof, the Full Proof is at 114, the CYPB comes in at 95, and as I mentioned, the new Single Barrel will come in at 97. Bufallo Trace knows where the money is, in creating these one-off, highly sought-after annual releases on top of the core range is just going to make them a lot more money and obviously drive the market on Weller into the stratosphere. So if you have tried Weller before in the past and you're sick and tired of chasing down or paying secondary market value for this once budget brand, then stay tuned for my top alternatives to Weller. First up, I wanted to start with the lower proof options and compare to the Weller Special Reserve and then work our way up from there. So first up, we have Maker's Mark and Maker's 46. These are obvious choices considering they also are wheated bourbon. They are 5 to 6 years old and has 16% wheat in the mash bill as well. Standard Maker's Mark is a classic option with notes of caramel, vanilla, corn, apricot, and apple. I do think Weller Special Reserve has more sweetness and caramel to it, but Maker's is available everywhere for about 23 bucks. Maker's 46, on the other hand, is probably my favorite in the core lineup. French oak staves are added to existing barrels and intended to spice up the whiskey during aging. What comes out of the barrel is Maker's Mark that is floral, fruity, laced with caramel, a little bit of chocolate. Yes, this is different and carries a bit more spice than Weller's Special Reserve, but it's an interesting and flavorful wheated bourbon. I think it's the best in the Maker's Mark core range. It also is available everywhere for about 40 bucks. Next up is Larceny. Now Larceny comes from Heaven Hill. It's bottled at 92 proof and uses barrels between 6 to 12 years old. This has a mash bill of 68% corn, 20% wheat, and 12% malted barley. One of the best and available wheaters on the shelf. Larceny comes off very floral and then gives you those typical vanilla, caramel notes along with Heaven Hill nuttiness. There's a hint of milk chocolate there and some typical wheater notes of apple and apricot. It's a great option, available everywhere for only around 24 bucks. Next up, we have Wyoming Whiskey Small Batch Bourbon. That's right, independent, family-owned whiskey makers with a world-class distillery in the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming. Partnered with the Nose, otherwise known as Nancy Fraley, Wyoming Whiskey has been crafting award-winning whiskey for the last several years. Their small batch bourbon is a wheated bourbon with a mash bill of 68% corn, 20% wheat, and 12% malted barley, all crafted from locally grown Wyoming grains. Their small batch bourbon is aged for a minimum of about 5 years. This is a lot of caramel, baking spices, cinnamon, vanilla, a hint of fruit. This was a surprise for me when I tasted it next to Weller. This has a bit more spice than the Weller, but the rich caramel and smooth sipping experience is all there. This is bottled at 88 proof and available for about 35 bucks. Lastly, in the lower proof range, we have Woodford Reserve Distiller Select. Now, I know what you're thinking, that's not a wheated bourbon, but I think it drinks like one. People that I've talked to that love Weller say how sweet and caramel forward it is. Well, I figure since Woodford is very caramel forward, I would compare it, and Woodford brought that intense caramel and sweetness along with an easy sipping experience like Weller Special Reserve. This is 90.4 proof, it's 72% corn, 18% rye, and 10% malted barley. It tends to be around 7 years old, and it's rich with apple, caramel, cinnamon, butterscotch. The flavors are very sweet, it's rich, it has a bit of spice, it's extremely balanced. Add an ice cube to this or a couple drops of water, and this drinks like candy in a glass. Available everywhere for about 35 bucks. Now we are moving up in proof and getting into the Weller Antique 107 realm. First up is Rebel Yell 100. Coming from Lux Row, this 100 proof wheated bourbon is for the budget sipper in all of us. For 20 bucks, this wheated bourbon, it's approachable, sweet. Since it's sourced from Heaven Hill, it tastes a little bit like peanut butter, vanilla, caramel, roasted corn. Listen, it's not complex, but the oily mouthfeel is what made me add this one to the list. It's straightforward, easy to sip, certainly a budget offering if you're looking for a wheated bourbon with a higher proof. Works great in cocktails as well. Next up is one of my new favorites, and that's Wilderness Trail Single Barrel. Now, Wilderness Trail opened in 2014, and their first release was this wheated, bottled and bond single barrel bourbon with a mash bill of 64% corn, 24% wheat, and 12% malted barley. The first release, which was 4 years old, is starting to get a bit older and more delicious as they just released some of their 6-year-old barrels. This is sweet, tastes like caramel apple, vanilla, honey, and some of them have this like sweet cookie dough note going on and some really nice sweet oak to balance it all out. I think this bourbon, out of all these selections, has the most potential to unseat Weller as everyone's favorite wheated bourbon to hunt down as this gets a little bit older down the line. It's available in about 21 states now and growing every day for about 50 bucks. Next up is a bourbon that is somewhere in between Weller 107 and Weller 12 year. It's Rebel Yell 10 year single barrel from Luxco. Now remember that name? Rebel Yell was one of the original Stutzel Weller brands. The first batch of 10-year-old single barrel Rebel Yell bourbon was launched in September 2016 and has since been released annually. Rebel Yell is a wheated Kentucky bourbon whiskey after 10 years in new charred American oak and bottled at 100 proof. This is sourced from Heaven Hill and is assumed to have a 20% wheat mash bill as well. This definitely brings some oak, vanilla, caramel sweetness. Being from Heaven Hill, it has a honey roasted peanut note, a ton of citrus, and a lot of baking spices as well. It's got a little bit of spice to it on the back end. It's actually what's in my glass right now. Being there are a few opportunities to taste and buy higher aged wheated bourbons anywhere north of a 90 proof, aside from Pappy van Winkle, William Larue Weller, all the Old Fitz decanter lineup. This bourbon is starting to creep up in price. This started out at 50 bucks when it was initially released and has now been creeping up into the $80, $90 range. Even at that price, I still think it's a great buy. One of the most overlooked wheated bourbons on the market. This is essentially Old Fitz from Heaven Hill, aged 10 years. It releases annually, so keep an eye out. Yeah, I'm gonna have some more. Now, when it comes to alternatives to Weller Full Proof, there are a couple of options now that won't break the bank. First up are another two selections from Maker's Mark. They're Cask Strength and they're Private Selects. Now, Maker's Mark Cask Strength is also around 6 years old, uncut, unfiltered, and can range in proof from about 108 to 115. It's everything we talked about earlier with standard makers, just amped up to 10. It's also available everywhere for about 40 bucks. I also wanted to mention the Maker's Private Select program, in which combinations of 10 different finishing staves are added to each barrel to create unique and delicious flavor profile. Now, this one happened to be released here in Ohio, and it's got a quirky name to it. It's called Caramel Mocha Bomb. You can see here on the front of the label, or in the close-ups that you saw, that it actually gives you what kind of staves are in the breakdown. This one gave it more of a caramel, chocolate type flavor profile to it. The combinations are endless, and when you find a mix of staves you like, these could be some of the best cask strength wheated bourbons on the market. Like single barrel store picks, these are made available through private stores or state selections for about 60 to 70 bucks. Lastly is Larceny Barrel Proof. Just introduced this year from Heaven Hill, Larceny Barrel Proof, similar to the strategy Heaven Hill utilizes with their Elijah Craig Barrel Proof lineup of multiple releases in a year. Larceny Barrel Proof will be released on an allocated basis 3 times per year, January, May, and September. Each release will have different proofs and consist of bourbon aged 6 to 8 years old. 2 batches have been released so far, and while I still think there are better releases to come, these provide a more accessible barrel-proof wheated bourbon than Weller Full Proof at a similar age and for most likely a fraction of the price. Larceny Full Proof is about 65 bucks. It's sweet, fruity, full of flavor. Like I said, I think as more releases come out, this will get better and better, and is a true barrel-proof wheated bourbon that can go head-to-head with Weller Full Proof. My last 2 selections aren't technically wheated bourbons, but they are wheated whiskeys. The difference being the most dominant grain in the mash bill being wheat instead of corn. Now, while that technically does not make this a bourbon, as an alternative for all you wheated bourbon fans out there, these are unique, available, and have a soft, sweet, and fruity flavor profile that make great alternatives. First is Bernheim Original 7-year-old wheat whiskey. This is from Heaven Hill, and typically no more than 100 barrels are selected to batch this whiskey together. It's bottled at 90 proof and retails for about 35 bucks. It's very caramel and vanilla forward, almost like vanilla ice cream with a little bit of caramel topping on top. Slight hint of fruit there and oak make this an easy sipper and puts it right in the mix of whiskeys that can go head-to-head with Weller Special Reserve. The last selection on this list is actually Woodford Reserve Wheat Whiskey, which is the latest addition to the Woodford Reserve family. This 4-grain whiskey is considered a wheat whiskey because its mash bill contains just over 50% wheat, but also contains corn, malt, and rye. This whiskey is basically a farmer's market in a glass, tons and tons of fruit, slight hint of spice. I would say this does have a different flavor profile when compared to Weller. While it may not be the caramel forward sipper like Weller, the unique mash bill, the fruit forward flavors, that easy sipping experience make this an interesting and unique alternative for only about 35 bucks. Weller is a great bourbon that seems to be still growing in popularity and in family members, as Bufallo Trace has no shortage of releases to add to their Weller lineup. But for those of you out there who are tired of the chase, I really hope you enjoyed the video and got some great alternative ideas for you to hunt down. If you did, hit that subscribe button below. Please hit that like button. If you have any find me on Instagram, find me on Twitter. Let me know what you think of the list. Let me know if there are any alternatives that you have tried that I might have missed. And as I always say, it's not about the whiskey, it's the people you share it with. So cheers, and I'll see you next time on the Mash and Drum.